Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be showing you how I use traditional stone masonry techniques to build stone foundation pillars that are going to support the pantry/utility room addition we're putting on the back of our cabin in the woods. So this is the back of our cabin, and it's the spot where I'm going to be building this pantry/utility room addition. You can see what it's going to look like here in this computer plan. The large section on the right isn't there yet in real life, but it's the central small section that I'm focusing on here. And the first step was for me to dig these holes to accommodate the foundation pillars down to bedrock, and to chop through a whole lot of really tough oak tree roots that were getting in the way of where the pillars would be located. Next, I lined each hole with a plywood form, all in a row, to accommodate concrete and act as footings to support the stone pillars on. Each form has two pieces of rebar drilled right into the rock, and you can see here that I've already filled those forms with concrete right up to ground level or so, and allowed that to harden. Now I'm at the stone field. The limestone here is basically just scrap from a local quarry that we obtained for our stonework here. And I'm going to start by cutting a block here, or rather splitting a block in this hydraulic foot-powered stone splitter, to see if I can get a nice flat surface. And as you see, it splits pretty easily, pretty incredible force there. And remarkably, the actual split surface is quite geometrical. It's rough and natural, which I like, but it's also fairly straight and flat. The trouble with the stone splitter was that it could only accommodate stones so thick. So massive 6 or 8 inch stones like the one I'm working on here, I had to fire up the stone saw and actually cut those most of the way through, which was a fairly arduous process, but it did make things a lot more manageable in terms of how thick of stones I was able to work with. The stone saw allowed me to score massive stones like this one, and then to simply break them into usable blocks. Next, I marked each block I had cut using a carpenter's square and a sharp shard of rock at 90 degrees, and then I used the hammer and chisel to chip away excess stone that was sticking beyond those 90-degree lines to basically make each stone into a more geometrical shaped block. Not only does this look a whole lot better with stone pillars, but it makes the pillars a whole lot easier to lay as well when the stone itself is pretty geometrical. I repeated the process of marking and chiseling the stone on all sides of every stone to make sure that there were no sides that stuck out beyond where they should have. And again, to make sure that each stone was as geometrical as possible, within reason, of course. I mean, this is stonework. These aren't concrete blocks, so there's always going to be some variation, and that's okay, but this step just refines things to a level where working with the stone is considerably easier. To get rid of the ugly, unnatural cut surfaces on the blocks made by the stone saw, I fired up an oxyacetylene torch and used the hot flame to flake off little bits of that cut surface, as you see here, until I restored a natural-looking stone surface to every cut face. The effect is quite striking, and it's a really handy trick. Once I finished cutting and shaping all the stone blocks, I loaded them one at a time into the quad trailer to transport them down to my cabin so I could actually start laying the stone. This was probably the physically toughest part of the job right here, simply because these stones were so heavy, particularly the full-size 18 by 18 inch ones like you see here, probably 7 or 8 inches thick. These likely weighed well over 200 pounds each, so I was grateful to have the four-wheeler and trailer to do most of the heavy lifting. Once I got to the cabin, I unloaded all the stones, laying them next to the concrete footings. Then it was time to mix some mortar using the same beat-up but reliable old cement mixer that my dad used while he was mixing mortar, building his stone house. I used a ratio of 1 part masonry cement, 1 part Portland cement, and 6 parts sand, and some water as well, which I kind of just did by eye, adding a little bit of extra water here and there to get the right texture. The right texture for laying stone, I find, is a buttery, floppy sort of mortar, as you see here. This is pretty much perfect and ready to dump. Once I brought the mortar down to my cabin to begin laying stone, the first step became to plop some mortar onto each concrete footing, one at a time, using the trowel, and to spread it to a fairly even layer, roughly 1 inch thick, to lay the first layer of stone. To make things easier when laying stone, I like to start each pillar with a full-sized piece, 18 by 18 inch, sweeping off the bottom of the stone to remove any debris so it bonds to the mortar properly. Again, these stones were terribly heavy, but it does save time when you only have to lay one stone per layer. With the first stone laid, I used my trowel to clean up the mortar squeezing out from underneath. This is known as pointing, cleaning up the mortar joints between each layer of stone, to give it, in this case, a still fairly rough and unrefined look, but a lot neater than just doing nothing. With the first stone laid and the pointing done, I'm checking it for level here in both directions, adjusting a little bit since the mortar's still soft. It's important to do this with every stone you lay to make sure the pillars are strong. Next, I'm repeating the process of plopping on some mortar and spreading it out into a 1 inch thick mortar bed in preparation for the second layer of stone in this pillar. The stone I'm laying here isn't a full-sized piece. I've divided this layer into 2 stones instead. Now I'm going to do what's called back buttering, the inside face of the stone, the face that will not be visible. Getting some fresh mortar and spreading it across the back of the stone, bonding the back of the stone to the mortar bed underneath. This just helps the stone sit more solidly when the mortar hardens, and it makes it easier to pack the mortar joint between the 2 stones before the second stone is even in place. And now I'm laying that second stone just as carefully as the first, and the idea is to make sure that the stones remain plumb compared to the first layer, and then pack some mortar in between the joint using a trowel. That's really important. You want to make sure that all joints are full when you're doing this sort of work. With the second layer of stones laid, I'm now spreading a third mortar bed for the third and final layer of stone, which again is made up of 2 stones. I've got one laid here already, and I'm just laying that second one. The stone on the left is tilting downwards a little bit, so here I'm lifting it and sticking some stone shards underneath into the mortar joint to hold it up and keep it level. Next, I used a thin mortar working tool called a slicker to pack mortar into the joint between these 2 stones from the top. With all the stones laid in this first pillar now, I'm using my small trowel to do the pointing. The idea here is to spend as little time working the mortar as possible, but to just make it neat and to make sure that it's properly packed in to each joint between the stones so that all stones are fully supported by mortar. One really useful technique I like to use when doing pointing is to use the larger trowel to hold mortar, while I use the smaller trowel and the slicker to push that mortar into the joints.
I would. My hands are a little dirty to drink it though. I really need water or juice too, and a lot of it.
With the pointing all done, this first stone foundation pillar is now complete. But I don't want to sit around admiring my work for too long because I still have mortar in the wheelbarrow that's hardening fast. It's time to move on to the other pillars. Here I'm finishing up the second foundation pillar using the same approach as the first, making sure the pillars are aligned with each other using a guide string. And now I'm laying the first full-size stone to start the third foundation pillar. There's going to be 6 in all. The sun was just starting to set, and I was just starting to run out of mortar as I finished the pointing on this third foundation pillar, the last one of the day. Here they all are finished, and they look great. I'm going to continue tomorrow and hopefully finish the other 3, and from there I can set some beams on these and begin the floor frame of my pantry addition. Thanks very much for watching this video on the traditional stone masonry techniques that I've used to build the stone foundation pillars for our utility room addition here at our cabin in the woods. Really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give the video a like, share it with your family and friends, and consider subscribing to the Cabin in the Woods channel for lots more great videos about our life here.